"She's just one of the locals," he said, the lie a venomous foreign thing in his mouth. From the air-conditioned bubble of his chauffeured car, the Nigerian tech billionaire watched his American fiancée laugh at the primitive sight of the old woman gathering sticks. But he saw her face. He saw the proud woman who had sold her last goat for his school books. He saw his mother. And in that single, soul-shattering moment of betrayal, their eyes met across the dusty road, and he knew he had just orphaned himself. Welcome back to Epic Narrative Tales, where we give you interesting and incredibly emotional stories for your enjoyment. Today's story is a real-life story that you would enjoy, so grab your blanket and your popcorn. Perhaps grab a couple tissues too. You're in for an emotional journey.
The air in the first-class cabin of the Lufthansa flight was a sterile, recycled atmosphere of quiet wealth. For Samuel Lawson, it was the air he had learned to breathe. He was a master of this world, the celebrated founder of Navigator, a company whose autopilot software was revolutionizing the automotive industry. He wore a simple but exquisitely tailored linen shirt, a picture of understated modern success. But as the plane began its descent over the sprawling, chaotic beauty of Lagos, Nigeria, a familiar, primal anxiety began to tighten its grip on his chest. Beside him, his fiancée, Chloe, pressed her face to the window, her expression one of wide-eyed, adventurous curiosity. "It's so vibrant," she said, as if describing a piece of art. "I can't wait to see the real Africa, the village, the culture. It's going to be so authentic." Samuel forced a smile. "It's definitely authentic." He was a man living a double life, a man stretched taut between two irreconcilable worlds. There was Samuel Lawson, the American tech titan, the prodigy who had gone from a scholarship student to a Silicon Valley king. And then there was Oluwa Samuel, the boy from a small, dusty village, the son of a widowed mother who had sacrificed everything for him. This trip was meant to be a bridge between those two worlds, a triumphant return, but he feared it would only be a collision. Thousands of feet below, in a small, neat mud-brick house in a village an hour's drive from the city, Iya Samuel was sweeping her compound with a palm frond broom. She was a woman whose dignity was woven into the very fabric of her being. Her face, a beautiful roadmap of a life of hard work and unwavering faith, was alight with a joy so profound it seemed to radiate from her being. Her son was coming home, her Samuel, the boy she had sent off to America with a small bag, a worn Bible, and a prayer so fierce it had followed him across the ocean. She had sold her best fabrics, her last goat, everything to ensure he had what he needed. His success was not his alone, it was the entire village's. Today he was returning not just as a man, but as a king, and he was bringing home a queen. Her heart was a drum of joyful anticipation. She had prepared his favorite stew, aired out the special occasion linens, and she kept looking towards the dusty road, waiting for the chariot of her triumphant, beloved son.
The journey from the air-conditioned chaos of Murtala Muhammad Airport to the village was a slow, jarring descent from one reality into another. They sat in the back of a private, chauffeured Land Cruiser, a bubble of cool, quiet luxury moving through a world of vibrant, overwhelming life. The sounds of Lagos, the relentless honking, the melodic cries of street vendors, the pulsing beat of Afrobeats from a nearby shop were a distant, muted soundtrack. Chloe was captivated, her phone out, taking pictures of everything. "Look, Samuel, the women with the baskets on their heads. It's so incredible. It's like a movie." Samuel's smile was tight, his knuckles white where he gripped his phone.
Every colorful market, every crowded street was a reminder of the world he had fought so hard to escape. To her, it was a fascinating cultural experience. To him, it was a landscape of a poverty he had almost forgotten the taste of. As they left the city's sprawl, the paved roads gave way to the rust-colored dirt of the countryside. The landscape became a blur of green palms and small, humble villages. They were getting close. The anxiety in Samuel's chest was now a physical, suffocating pressure. How could he possibly explain the woman who lived in a mud-brick hut to the woman who grew up in a Park Avenue penthouse? The chasm between them seemed too vast to bridge. It was on a long, straight stretch of road, just a few miles from his village, that he saw her. His mother. She was on the side of the road, her back bent, her movements slow and methodical as she gathered fallen branches and twigs, bundling them into a neat pile for firewood. She wore a simple, faded wrapper, her feet bare against the red earth. She was a portrait of a life of humble, unending labor, a life he had left behind. His heart seized in his chest, a painful, violent lurch of love, of memory, and of a deep, soul-crushing shame. "Oh, look at that poor old woman," Chloe said, her voice laced not with malice, but with a naive, pitying condescension. "God, it's just so primitive. Can you imagine having to do that every day just to cook your dinner?" She turned to him, her eyes wide with a tourist's fascination. "Do you know her? Is she from your village?" This was it, the moment of collision. The two worlds, Chloe and his mother, were now in the same frame, and he was in the middle. His mind raced, a frantic, panicked scramble. To admit it, to say, "Yes, that is my mother," would be to shatter the carefully constructed image of the sophisticated, worldly man he had become. It would be to expose the raw, impoverished roots he had tried so desperately to conceal. And in a moment of pure, cowardly, and catastrophic weakness, he chose the lie. He let out a small, dismissive laugh, a sound so foreign and ugly it felt like it had been torn from someone else's throat. "Her? No," he said, the words a venomous, foreign thing in his mouth. "She's just one of the locals." At that exact moment, as the Land Cruiser began to slow for a pothole, his mother, Iya Samuel, looked up. Perhaps she had heard the sound of the expensive car. Perhaps she had simply felt the presence of her son. Her eyes, so full of a lifetime of love, met his through the polished, tinted glass. And she saw him. And she saw the beautiful, pale woman beside him. And she saw the dismissive shake of his head. She didn't need to hear the words. She saw the denial in his eyes, the shame, the betrayal. The proud, joyful light in her face, the light that had been burning so brightly in anticipation of his arrival, was extinguished in an instant. Her smile faltered and died. Her shoulders, which had carried so many burdens with such uncomplaining strength, seemed to slump, to break. It was a wound so deep, so absolute, it was as if he had struck her. She immediately looked away, back down at the sticks on the ground, making herself small, as if to erase herself, to lessen the burden of her own shameful existence on his magnificent, important son. The car rolled past. Chloe, oblivious, was already pointing her phone at something else, but Samuel couldn't breathe. He was staring straight ahead, but all he could see was his mother's face, the look of dawning, soul-shattering heartbreak. He had not just denied a local, he had orphaned himself, and in the silent, air-conditioned bubble of his new life, he had just committed a sin so profound that the price, he knew, with a terrifying, divine certainty, would be everything. The final few miles to the village were driven in a thick, suffocating silence. Samuel's lie had sucked all the air out of the car. He felt Chloe's gaze on him, no longer full of a tourist's easy curiosity, but with a new, sharp, and unnerving scrutiny. His quick, cold denial had been a jarringly false note in the symphony of the perfect, charming man she thought she knew. It hadn't just been a dismissal, it had been cruel, and it had been instant, too instant. A seed of doubt, tiny but persistent, had been planted. When they arrived at the village, a small crowd had gathered, the triumphant welcome his mother had planned. Elders, cousins, neighbors, all there to celebrate the return of their king. They cheered as Samuel stepped out of the car. He forced a smile, a brittle, agonizing mask, and played his part. But his eyes were frantically scanning the crowd for his mother. She was not there. An aunt pulled him into a fierce hug. "Ah, Iya Samuel, welcome home. Your mother, she was here just a moment ago. She said she was not feeling well. She has gone back to her hut to rest." The lie was so polite, so full of a grace he did not deserve, that it was 100 times more damning than any shouted accusation could have been. She was protecting him. She was hiding her own monumental pain to save his face in front of his new queen. The shame was a physical, burning thing in his gut. "Let's go see her," Chloe said, her voice now carrying a cool, watchful edge. The walk to his mother's hut was a walk of shame. The small, neat mud brick house, once a source of quiet, remembered comfort, now felt like a tribunal. They found Iya Samuel inside, sitting on a low stool in the dim light, her hands resting in her lap. The joyful, expectant energy of the morning was gone, replaced by a profound, soul-deep weariness. "Mama," Samuel said, the word feeling clumsy and false in his mouth, "this is Chloe." His mother looked up, and her eyes, they were the eyes of a stranger. The warm, loving light was gone, replaced by a polite, distant emptiness. She was looking at him as she would a guest, not her own son. "You are welcome," she said, her voice a quiet, formal murmur. She did not rise, she did not embrace him. It was a slight so profound, so contrary to their culture's effusive warmth, that it was a silent, screaming condemnation. The official meeting was a masterpiece of agonizing tension. Samuel, trapped in his lie, had to pretend this was the first time he was seeing her. He tried to fill the silence with loud, false cheer, asking about her health, about the village, his words echoing unnaturally in the small hut. Chloe sat, watching, her eyes moving from Samuel's strained, desperate performance to the old woman's deep, quiet, and impenetrable sorrow. And she knew. She didn't know how she knew, but she knew. The woman on the road and the woman sitting before her were the same. That night, back in the sterile, air-conditioned luxury of their hotel suite in Lagos, the facade finally shattered. "That was your mother, wasn't it?" Chloe asked. She was not shouting. Her voice was quiet, calm, and as sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. She was standing by the window, her arms crossed, her engagement ring a cold, hard glint in the city lights. Samuel froze, a glass of water halfway to his lips. "What are you talking about?" he lied again, the words weak and pathetic. "Don't," she said, her voice cutting him off. "Don't insult my intelligence. The woman on the road, the local, that was your mother, wasn't it?" He had nowhere left to run. The lie, which had been born of a desperate, fleeting moment of shame, now stood before him, a fully formed monster, demanding its due. "Yes," he whispered, the single word a confession, a surrender, a final damning verdict on his own character. Chloe didn't rage, she didn't cry. The look on her face was far worse. It was a look of profound, clinical disappointment, the look of an investor who has just realized the asset they poured their heart into is a fraudulent shell. "Why?" she asked, the question not an accusation, but a genuine, horrified inquiry. "Why would you do that?" "You wouldn't understand," he stammered, scrambling for an excuse. "The poverty, the way I grew up. I was ashamed."
"Ashamed?" she repeated, and now her voice began to rise, not with anger, but with a cold, clear, and righteous fury. "Of that woman? That woman who sold her last goat for you? That woman who looked at you with more love than I have ever seen in my life, even after you had just publicly disowned her? You weren't ashamed of her, Samuel. You were ashamed of yourself, and you used her as a shield." She walked towards him, her eyes blazing with a clarity that seared him to the soul. "I can handle poverty. I can handle a different culture. I am not a fool, but I cannot handle this hollowness, this weakness at the very core of you." She wasn't just seeing his lie, she was seeing the rot beneath it, the deep, profound insecurity of a man who was so terrified of his past that he would commit the ultimate act of cruelty to escape it. And in that moment, she knew she could not build a life on such a hollow foundation. The man she thought she was marrying did not exist.
Samuel stood in the sterile silence of the hotel room, the full, catastrophic weight of Chloe's words crashing down on him. Hollowness, weakness at the very core of you. She had not just uncovered his lie, she had diagnosed his soul. He had no defense. She was right. "Chloe, please," he began, taking a step towards her, his hands outstretched in a desperate, pleading gesture. "It was a moment, a single, stupid, unforgivable moment. It's not who I am." "Isn't it?" she countered, her voice dangerously quiet. She didn't back away. She stood her ground, an immovable force of moral clarity. "Who we are is what we do in those moments, Samuel, when the pressure is on, when we're afraid. And in that moment, you chose to throw the woman who gave you life under a bus to protect your own fragile ego. That's not just a mistake, that's a character statement." Every word was a nail in the coffin of the man he had pretended to be. He had spent years building a persona of a strong, self-made, confident titan of industry, and she, in this single devastating exchange, had stripped it all away, leaving only the terrified, ashamed boy from the village. "I can fix this," he said, his mind scrambling, reverting to the only problem-solving method he knew. "I'll apologize, I'll explain, I'll buy her a new house, I'll build a school in the village in her name, I'll give her anything she wants." And that was his final, fatal error, the suggestion that this profound spiritual wound could be healed with money. Chloe let out a short, bitter, humorless laugh. It was the sound of a dream dying. "You still don't get it," she said, a look of profound, sorrowful pity on her face. "You can't buy your way out of this. This isn't a business deal, Samuel. This is about honor. It's about a sacred bond you broke without a second thought." She looked at him, at the man she had loved, the man she had planned to build a future with, and she saw him for what he truly was, a ghost, a man so haunted by the poverty he had come from that he had become impoverished in his soul. With a quiet, deliberate finality, she slipped the massive diamond ring from her finger. The stone, which had once been a symbol of their brilliant, perfect future, now felt like a cold, heavy lie. She didn't throw it at him. She didn't place it on the table. She simply held it in her open palm. "I can't marry a ghost, Samuel," she said, her voice now soft, but every word a final, devastating blow. "I can't build a life with a man who is ashamed of the very roots that made him. The man who would deny his own mother to impress a girl is not a man at all. He will eventually deny his wife too. He will deny his own children, because when you are hollow at the core, everything eventually collapses." She closed her hand around the ring. "I'm flying back to the States, tonight. My assistant is making the arrangements." She walked past him, her movements calm and resolute. She picked up her purse.
She did not look at him again. "Chloe, wait!" he pleaded, his voice a broken, desperate whisper. She paused at the door, her back to him. "Goodbye, Samuel," she said, and then she was gone. The click of the hotel room door shutting was the loudest sound he had ever heard. It was the sound of his entire, glittering, carefully constructed world imploding. The woman he loved was gone. The respect he had craved was gone. All that was left was him, a new billionaire, standing alone in a luxury hotel room in the country of his birth, a king who had just been deposed, not by a rival, but by the weakness of his own character. He sank onto the edge of the bed, the silence of the room a roaring accusation. He was a titan of industry, a visionary, a success, and in a single cowardly moment he had become what he had always feared he was: nothing. He was no longer Samuel Lawson, the American success story. He was just Iya Samuel, the boy who had broken his mother's heart. And in the vast, echoing emptiness of his new life, he was utterly, completely, and finally alone.
For 2 days, Samuel remained in the gilded cage of his hotel suite, a prisoner of his own shame. He didn't answer the frantic calls from his office in San Francisco. He didn't respond to the clipped, professional texts from Chloe's assistant confirming her departure. He just sat, the city of Lagos a distant, meaningless blur outside his window, the ghost of his mother's heartbroken face his only companion. The hollowness Chloe had spoken of was now a vast, echoing chasm inside him. His wealth, his success, his entire American identity, it was all a cheap, gaudy costume, and the woman he loved had ripped it away, leaving him naked and exposed. He had flown across the world to build a bridge between his two lives, and had instead, with a single cowardly lie, burned both worlds to the ground. He knew what he had to do. The thought was terrifying, more terrifying than any boardroom showdown or high-stakes negotiation. An apology to Chloe was impossible now. He had to earn the right to even speak her name again. But an apology to his mother, that was not just a right, it was a sacred, spiritual necessity. He could not move forward, he could not live another day with this poison in his soul until he faced her. He didn't take the chauffeured Land Cruiser. He didn't call for a car. He did it the way he would have as a boy. He walked to the bus park, the chaotic, vibrant heart of the city, and he got on a crowded, dusty bus heading towards his village. The journey was a jarring, humbling penance. He was pressed on all sides by the very people he had tried to rise above, the sounds and smells of his childhood, a relentless, accusing chorus. When he finally arrived at the edge of his village, he did not walk the main path. He walked the long way around, a prodigal son returning not in glory, but in absolute, crushing disgrace. He found her sitting outside her small, neat hut, shelling beans into a large wooden bowl. The joyful, expectant energy he had sensed from a distance just days ago was gone. She was shrouded in a profound, quiet grief, a stillness so deep it seemed to absorb the light around her. She looked up as he approached, and her eyes held no anger. They held no recrimination. They held only a deep, weary, and impenetrable sorrow. It was the look of a mother who had not just been insulted, but whose heart had been fundamentally, irrevocably broken. He stopped a few feet from her, the prodigal son standing before her judge. The eloquent, powerful CEO was gone. All that was left was Iya Samuel, a boy who had strayed too far from home. "Mama," he began, his voice a choked, unfamiliar thing. He switched to Yoruba, the language of his heart, the language of his shame. "Mo binu, Mama. Mo binu pupo. I am sorry, Mama. I am so sorry." She did not respond.
She just continued to shell the beans, her hands moving with a slow, methodical rhythm, as if he were not there. Her silence was not a punishment. It was a wall of pain so high he did not know how he could ever climb it. This was his final, most important test. He could not buy her forgiveness. He could not command it. He had to earn it. His grand gesture was not an offer of money. It was an act of complete and utter surrender. He walked over, sat on the dirt at her feet, and simply stayed. He didn't speak again. He just sat in silence for hours. He was no longer the billionaire. He was just her son, present, humbled, and waiting. He was giving her the one thing he had never truly given her, his time, his undivided, respectful presence. The sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the compound. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, her hands stilled in the bowl of beans. She looked up at him, at the son of her heart, sitting in the dust at her feet. She saw not the American Titan, but the small boy she had raised, the boy whose future she had prayed for every single day. And her mother's grace, a force more powerful than any pride or any pain, finally won. A single slow tear traced a path through the proud, weathered lines of her face. "Oluwasamuel, Omomi," she whispered, her voice a fragile, trembling thing. "Oluwasamuel, my child." He looked up, his own eyes swimming with tears. She reached out and placed her hand on his head, a gesture of blessing, of forgiveness, of an unconditional love so profound it was a divine act. "You forgot who you are," she said softly in Yoruba, "but you have come home. That is all that matters." He leaned forward, burying his face in her lap, and he wept. He wept for his lie, for his shame, for the woman he had lost, and for the mother he had almost thrown away. She just held him, her calloused, loving hand stroking his hair, as the quiet, forgiving darkness of the Nigerian night settled around them. The story didn't end with him getting on the next flight back to San Francisco to win Chloe back. It ended with him staying. He stayed for a week, and then another. He ate his mother's stew. He helped thatch a neighbor's roof. He sat with the elders and listened to their stories. He spoke his language. He walked the red earth of his home. He was not Samuel Lawson, the billionaire, playing a role. He was Oluwasamuel, a son, remembering who he was. His healing, the real, true, and necessary healing, had finally, at long last, begun.
He flew across the world to show off a kingdom, and in a single moment he became a pauper in his own soul. This is a story that reminds us that a mother's heart is our first home, and to be exiled from it is the greatest poverty of all. If you believe in the sacred power of a mother's grace, if you believe that no one is too lost to find their way home, then your subscription is a prayer for every prodigal son and daughter. It's a testament to the roots that hold us and the forgiveness that saves us.